My name is Alara, and I am 42 years old. The world knows my brother as a philanthropist, a titan of industry, the man who saved our family's legacy. But they don't know that the foundation of his empire is built on a tomb mine. Before we dive into the secret I've carried for all these years, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below guessing what the final twist will be. Now, where were we? My story doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with love, the pure, uncomplicated love of a family that seemed to have everything. We grew up in a house where the walls were lined with books, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and my mother's oil paints. Our parents were academics, gentle souls who valued curiosity and kindness above all else. My brother, Julian, and I were inseparable. He was 2 years older, my shadow and my hero. He was the charming one, the one with the easy smile and the magnetic personality. I was the quiet one, the observer, the one who lived inside my head, happiest with a complex problem to solve. My gift wasn't charm, it was logic. From a young age, I saw the world in patterns and systems and code. While Julian was winning school elections, I was in my room, teaching myself to program on a clunky desktop computer, building worlds out of pure logic. My parents nurtured this. My father would bring me books on cryptography and algorithmic theory, his eyes shining with pride as I devoured them. We had a bond forged in intellectual fire. Julian was my mother's boy. She adored his charisma, his effortless grace. She saw in him the reflection of a socialite she might have been had she not chosen a quiet life of art and academia. We were a perfect, balanced family, or so I believed. As we grew older, our paths diverged, yet they remained intertwined. Julian went to business school. I pursued computer science and theoretical mathematics. But we were always working towards a shared dream, to modernize our family's legacy. Our grandfather had started a respectable, if somewhat old-fashioned, investment firm. It was our plan to bring it into the 21st century. Julian would be the face, the deal-maker. I would be the engine, the architect. My life's work, my entire academic and professional focus, was poured into a single, massive project, a revolutionary algorithmic trading system. I called it Cassandra. It was more than just a program. It was a predictive ecosystem. It analyzed not just market data, but geopolitical news, shifts in social sentiment, even weather patterns. It was designed to anticipate market movements with an accuracy no one had ever achieved. It was beautiful. It was my soul translated into code. Julian was my biggest cheerleader. He'd look over my shoulder as I worked, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and, I thought, admiration. "You're a genius, Alara," he'd say, clapping me on the shoulder. "Together, we're going to change the world with this." I believed him. I trusted him with every line of code, every secret of my creation. He was my brother, my other half. The betrayal came 20 years ago. It was swift, silent, and absolute. We were on the cusp of launching Cassandra within the family firm. Everything was ready. Our father, who was nearing retirement, was going to announce us as his joint successors at the annual shareholder meeting. The night before the meeting, Julian came to my apartment. He brought a bottle of expensive champagne. "To us," he toasted, his smile as warm and familiar as ever. "To the future." I drank with him. I felt giddy with excitement, with the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. The next morning, I woke up to my world in ashes. I was late. My head was pounding, a fog clouding my mind unlike any hangover I'd ever known. I rushed to the office, my phone buzzing with frantic messages. When I burst into the boardroom, all eyes turned to me, not with anticipation, but with cold, hard judgment. Julian was at the head of the table, next to my father. His face wasn't triumphant. It was a mask of sorrowful disappointment. On the main screen were emails, leaked documents, bank transfers, all showing, irrefutably, that I had sold key components of the Cassandra source code to a rival firm. It was a complete fabrication, a digital ghost so expertly crafted it was indistinguishable from reality. But I knew, in that gut-sinking moment, who the ghostwriter was. Julian stood up. His voice, thick with false emotion, spoke of his shock, his heartbreak. He spoke of my greed, my jealousy. He painted me as a traitor who had tried to sabotage her own family for a quick payday. My father, My father looked at me, his face a ruin of confusion and pain. I tried to speak, to defend myself. It wasn't me. Julian, tell them. I pleaded, my voice cracking. Julian just shook his head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. I don't know who you are anymore, Alara, he whispered. And that was it. I was condemned. My parents, shattered and humiliated, asked me to leave. To disappear. There was no trial, no police. They wanted to handle it, in the family, to avoid a public scandal. And handling it meant excising me like a tumor. I was disowned, my name struck from the family trust, my access to everything I had ever known severed. I walked out of that building with nothing but my handbag and the clothes on my back. I had been erased. I tried to fight it. I hired a lawyer, but the digital evidence was a fortress. Julian had used my own skills against me. He had built a perfect, airtight cage. My parents refused to see me, to even take my calls. My father sent one last, brutal letter. It said, "You have broken your mother's heart. For all I care, you are dead to us." That was the day I died. The old Alara, the trusting girl who loved her brother, who believed in family and shared dreams, she was buried. And in her place, something new, something cold and hard and patient began to grow. The wilderness years, as I call them, were brutal. I drifted, taking menial jobs under a new name, a ghost haunting the edges of society. I worked as a cleaner, a barista, a data entry clerk in a windowless basement. Every day was a struggle for survival. And every night, I was haunted by Julian's face, his feigned sorrow, the look in my father's eyes. The pain was a physical thing, a constant weight on my chest. But underneath the pain, a cold fire was kindled. Revenge. It's a word that tastes like ash, but for me, it was the only thing that kept me alive. It wasn't an impulsive, fiery rage. It was a slow, glacial pressure building deep within me. I watched from the shadows as Julian soared. Using Cassandra, which he renamed Titan, he transformed the family firm into a global powerhouse. He became the darling of the financial world, his face on magazine covers, his name synonymous with genius and innovation. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a brand. The benevolent visionary, the devoted family man who had saved his legacy from his own sister's treachery. He spoke of me sometimes, in carefully curated interviews. He'd get a sad, faraway look in his eyes and speak of a tragedy of his sister, the brilliant mind lost to her own demons. He was sculpting a myth, and I was its villain. The world bought it, every last word. He even started a foundation in our mother's name after she passed away, a foundation for promoting ethics in technology. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost sublime. I lived a Spartan life, saving every penny, my existence pared down to a single purpose. I taught myself new coding languages, studied the emerging field of cybersecurity, not for creation, but for deconstruction. I learned how to be invisible online, how to navigate the dark corners of the web, how to be a ghost in the machine. For 10 years, I just watched. I studied him. I learned his habits, his routines, his digital footprint, the architecture of the empire he had built on my bones. I knew the names of his assistants, his drivers, his programmers. I knew the vulnerabilities in his network because I had designed the foundations they were built on. But watching wasn't enough. The fire needed fuel. The real turning point, the moment my cold, patient anger finally crystallized into a diamond-hard plan, came 6 years ago. My father died. I learned about it from a small obituary in an online paper. Julian had given a glowing eulogy, of course. A week after the funeral, a small, plain package arrived at my shabby apartment. There was no return address. Inside was a leather-bound journal. It was my mother's. The last entry was dated 2 days before she died of a heart attack, years earlier. Her elegant script was shaky, ravaged by guilt and grief. She wrote about the night before my exile. She had been unable to sleep and had walked past Julian's study. She overheard him on the phone laughing, bragging to someone about how he'd finally neutralized me, how Cassandra was all his now, how he'd used a deepfake voice algorithm and faked the server logs. She knew. My mother had known the entire time. She wrote of how she confronted him and how he had turned on her with a coldness she had never seen. He threatened her. He told her if she ever spoke a word of it, he would not only destroy the family's reputation but would produce new evidence, that would see me imprisoned for life. He would use his power to ensure I rotted in a cell. So she stayed silent, to protect me. Her last words in the journal were a desperate plea. Ilara, if you ever read this, know that I knew. I was a coward. Forgive me. Avenge yourself. Avenge us both. Holding that journal, the cold fire inside me erupted into an inferno. My grief was incinerated, leaving behind only purpose. The person who sent the journal remained a mystery, a silent benefactor. But it didn't matter. They had given me the one thing I needed more than money or power, certainty. My brother wasn't just a greedy opportunist. He was a monster who had tortured his own mother into silence and let her die with that secret. My plan for revenge was no longer about just taking back what was mine. It was about eradication. It was about razing his entire world to the ground. And I knew exactly how to do it. This is where the story twists. This is the secret I've carried. Julian didn't just steal Cassandra. He stole a Trojan horse. You see, even in my youth, I was paranoid. I understood that something as powerful as Cassandra could be a target. Deep within its core architecture, buried under layers of decoy code and quantum encryption, I had planted a seed. A fail-safe, a meticulously designed logic bomb, a self-destruct sequence woven into the very fabric of the algorithm. I called it Persephone, the queen of the underworld, destined to return from the darkness. Persephone wasn't just a kill switch, it was far more elegant. For 20 years, it had lain dormant, but it hadn't been idle. It was designed to do the opposite of Cassandra. While Cassandra learned to build, Persephone learned to destroy. It subtly, invisibly, over 2 decades, introduced microscopic flaws into the system's core logic. It encouraged and rewarded infinitesimally risky trades, weaving a web of systemic fragility so complex and so deeply embedded that it was completely invisible. It allowed Julian's firm to grow, to become a global giant, but it built that empire on a foundation of sand. Every success, every billion-dollar profit, was just Persephone adding another floor to a skyscraper it knew it was going to demolish. My mother's journal was the key. The final algorithm to activate Persephone was a passphrase, an alphanumeric key encrypted within the activation code. And that key was a sentence from my mother's favorite book, a book she used to read to me as a child, a sentence I found in her final, heartbreaking entry. He had given me the sword, and my mysterious benefactor had just handed me the stone to sharpen it. The last 6 years have been about preparation. I moved from the shadows into the light, but under a new identity. I became Helena, a quiet but brilliant cybersecurity consultant. I built a reputation, a portfolio of successes. It wasn't difficult. Catching lesser wolves is easy when you've spent 2 decades studying the alpha. I maneuvered my way into a contract with a firm that audited the systems of Sterlingthorne, Julian's company. It was the ultimate irony. He was paying me, his ghost, to look for vulnerabilities in the system I had created and corrupted. I spent 3 months inside their digital walls. They saw me as a competent, boring auditor. They had no idea I was a queen returning to her kingdom. I didn't need to plant anything new. I just needed to check on my life's true work. Persephone was there waiting, a sleeping dragon woven from numbers, ready to wake up and breathe fire. The final stage of my plan was set for the night of the annual Sterlingthorne Foundation Charity Gala, the 20th anniversary of the foundation in our mother's name. The pinnacle of Julian's hypocrisy. He was set to receive a Humanitarian of the Year award. The event would be broadcast live, attended by the most powerful people in finance, politics, and media. It was the perfect stage. The night of the gala, I wasn't in the audience. I was in a small, sterile data center miles away, a place I had rented under my Helena identity. I had my laptop, a secure satellite uplink, and a single glass of water. On my screen, I had 3 windows open. One showed the live feed of the gala. Another showed the real-time performance of the global stock markets. The third was a simple command line interface, blinking, waiting. I watched as Julian took the stage. He looked older, but he was still handsome, still radiating that effortless charm. He placed his hands on the podium and began his speech. "My mother, Eleanor," he began, his voice filled with practiced emotion, "taught me that our greatest purpose is to lift others up." I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a profound, chilling stillness. The time for emotion was over. He spoke about legacy, about integrity, about the tragic missteps of those who lose their way. He was talking about me. As he neared the crescendo of his speech, I began to type. I logged into the back door I'd left for myself 20 years ago, a door no one had ever found. And I entered the passphrase from my mother's journal. I typed the final command. Wake up, Persephone. I hit enter. On the live feed, the massive screens behind Julian, which were supposed to be showing a heartwarming montage of his humanitarian work, flickered. For a split second, they went black. Then, they exploded with data. Not a montage. It was the raw, unedited log of the Persephone algorithm. A cascading waterfall of code, followed by a single, stark sentence in blazing red letters. Cassandra's sequence terminated. Persephone protocol enacted. In the second window on my screen, the markets began to hemorrhage. The intricate web of interconnected, high-risk positions that Persephone had spent 20 years building began to unravel all at once. Sterling Thorne's core algorithm wasn't just failing, it was actively, malevolently liquidating its own assets at a catastrophic loss, triggering a chain reaction across every market it touched. It was a digital self-immolation, a corporate self-destruction of spectacular proportions. Julian had stopped talking. He stared, uncomprehending, at the screens. The audience was murmuring, people pulling out their phones, the panic spreading like a contagion. But I wasn't finished. The final phase of the protocol activated. The screens behind Julian changed again. This time, it showed the documents Julian had forged 20 years ago to frame me. And alongside them a recording. The audio from the phone call my mother had overheard. Julian's voice, young, arrogant, and cruel, laughing about how he had neutralized me. The final plot twist wasn't just that I had triggered the collapse. The twist was that the company he had stolen was never designed to succeed. His entire life, his entire legacy, was a trap that I had set for him when I was just a girl. He thought he was a king, but he was just a pawn in a game he never even knew he was playing. He hadn't stolen my masterpiece. He had stolen my weapon, aimed it at himself, and I had just spent 20 years letting him pull the trigger in slow motion. I watched his face on the screen. The charm evaporated. The confidence crumbled. In its place was the raw, naked terror of a man who had just realized his entire reality was a lie. He looked small, pathetic. He wasn't a titan. He was just my brother, a boy who had broken his favorite toy. I closed the laptop. The great work was done. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served, or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss next week's chilling confession. There is no satisfaction in revenge. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. There is no glorious feeling of victory, no sweet release. I thought that razing Julian's world to the ground would fill the void that he had carved into my soul 20 years ago. It didn't. I just stood there, in that cold, quiet room, surrounded by the silence of a completed task. I had dedicated my life to the single moment, and now that it was over, I was simply empty. The fire that had kept me going for 2 decades had consumed its fuel, and now it was gone, leaving nothing but smoke and cold ash. I had my justice. The world now knew the truth. Julian was ruined, a pariah. The family name was destroyed, just as he had feared. But my mother was still gone. My father was still gone. And the 20 years I had spent in the wilderness, living as a ghost, were years I could never get back. I had sacrificed my life to prove I was alive. Was it worth it? I look at my hands. They didn't build an empire. They didn't heal anyone. They built a magnificent, intricate, beautiful weapon of destruction. And they are empty. Revenge is a ghost story you tell yourself. But in the end, you're the one who ends up haunted. I am no longer a ghost in the world, but perhaps I am now a ghost to myself. I am a Lara again. And I have absolutely no idea who that is. But the story doesn't end with emptiness, because emptiness, I discovered, is just another kind of fullness, a space that demands to be filled with something other than revenge, and the universe abhors a vacuum as much as the human soul does. I sat in that data center for hours after I closed the laptop, watching the water in my glass grow warm, watching the security lights blink their mindless patterns, watching my reflection in the dark screen, and barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. She looked older than 42. This woman, worn down by 2 decades of singular purpose, her face a map of sleepless nights and cold determination, and I wondered if Julian would even recognize me if we passed on the street, wondered if I'd become as much a ghost to myself as I'd been to the world. The news cycle exploded within hours, as I knew it would, because the collapse of Sterling Thorn wasn't just a corporate scandal, it was a seismic event that rippled through global markets, affecting pension funds and retirement accounts, and the savings of millions of people who'd never heard of Julian or Cassandra or the family drama that had spawned this catastrophe. I watched the coverage from my apartment, the same shabby studio I'd lived in for 5 years, the place where Helena, the cybersecurity consultant, had existed as a shell around Alara, the avenging ghost, and I felt something I hadn't anticipated: guilt. Not for Julian, not for the brother who'd stolen my life and let our mother die in silent agony, but for all the innocent people whose lives I'd disrupted as collateral damage in my private war, the pensioners who'd lost their savings, the employees who'd lost their jobs, the investors who'd trusted in Julian's carefully constructed myth and paid the price for my revenge. The media tried to find Helena, of course, because the audit trail led back to the cybersecurity firm where I'd worked. But Helena had been as carefully constructed as Julian's frame job, a digital phantom with fake credentials and a false history, and she dissolved into nothing the moment I stopped maintaining her. The firm claimed they'd been duped, that Helena had been an imposter, and they were probably telling the truth from their perspective, because from where they stood, she had been. I'd given them a ghost to chase while the real architect of Sterling Thorn's destruction watched from the shadows, and I was good enough at being invisible that they never found me, never connected the dots back to Alara, the disgraced daughter who'd supposedly betrayed her family 2 decades ago. Julian's fall was spectacular and complete, exactly as I designed it, but watching it unfold in real time was different than imagining it during all those years of planning. The financial press eviscerated him, calling him a fraud and a charlatan, and the personal press was even worse, digging into his carefully curated image and finding cracks everywhere. His wife left him, taking their 3 children, my nieces and nephews who I'd watched from afar but never met, and I felt a complicated grief for them, these innocents who'd lost their father not to death but to exposure, who'd have to grow up knowing their dad was a thief and a liar. The humanitarian foundation in our mother's name was dissolved amid scandal, the board members fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, and I wondered what our mother would have thought about that, whether she'd have been relieved to have her name removed from Julian's hypocrisy or devastated to see the family name destroyed so completely. The criminal investigation started within weeks, prosecutors smelling blood in the water, and they found the evidence I'd left for them, the breadcrumb trail of Julian's original frame job, the forged documents and fake transfers, the audio recording of him bragging about neutralizing me. They found it all because I designed Persephone to expose everything in its final sequence, to burn down not just Julian's empire but his freedom, his reputation, his entire existence. He was arrested on fraud charges, corporate espionage, market manipulation, and a dozen other counts that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. And I watched the footage of him being led away in handcuffs, his head down, his expensive suit looking suddenly cheap under the harsh glare of justice, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a vast and echoing emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. My mother's journal sat on my kitchen table, the leather worn from 20 years of handling, and I read it again and again in those first weeks after the collapse, looking for something I'd missed, some sign that she'd have wanted this, that she'd have approved of what I'd done in her name. Her final words haunted me: avenge yourself. Avenge us both. But had I avenged us, or had I just perpetuated the cycle of destruction that had defined our family since my grandfather started that investment firm, since my father had chosen corporate success over emotional connection, since Julian had decided his ambition mattered more than his sister's life? I destroyed Julian the way he destroyed me, and in doing so I destroyed countless others, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd become exactly what I'd set out to punish, a person who'd sacrifice anyone and anything for their own sense of justice. The mysterious benefactor who'd sent me my mother's journal never revealed themselves, and I spent months trying to track them down, using all the skills I developed over 2 decades of living in the shadows, but they were better at hiding than I was at finding. I created theories in my head, elaborate stories about who they might be, and why they'd waited until my father died to send the journal, whether they'd been protecting him or me, or just waiting for the right moment to detonate a bomb they'd been carrying for years. I wondered if it was one of my father's colleagues who'd known the truth, or one of my mother's friends who'd suspected, or even someone in Julian's inner circle who'd grown disgusted by his hypocrisy and wanted to see him fall. But without evidence, they remained a ghost in my story, a plot device without motivation or identity, and eventually I stopped looking because it didn't matter anymore, because the journal had served its purpose, and the benefactor had presumably gotten whatever satisfaction they'd sought from my revenge. I tried to return to coding, thinking maybe I could reclaim the joy I'd felt when I was young, when writing algorithms was about creation rather than destruction, when Cassandra had been a project I'd loved rather than the seed of my own ruin. But every time I opened my laptop and stared at a blank screen, all I could see was Persephone, the most elegant piece of code I'd ever written, a masterpiece of patient destruction that had worked exactly as designed, and I couldn't separate the pride I felt in its technical perfection from the horror I felt about what it had done. I'd proven I was the genius everyone had once believed me to be, had created something that had fooled the world's best programmers and analysts for 20 years, but that proof had come at a cost I was only beginning to understand, and I wasn't sure I could ever write code again without wondering if I was creating something beautiful or just another weapon waiting for its moment to destroy. The trial was a media circus, of course, because Julian's fall from grace was too spectacular to be anything else, and I watched every minute of it from my apartment, hidden behind drawn curtains, my face illuminated only by the glow of my laptop screen. The prosecutors presented their case with ruthless efficiency, laying out Julian's crimes in meticulous detail, and Julian's lawyers tried to argue that he'd been framed, that someone had planted the evidence, that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax, but the evidence was too strong, too comprehensive, too obviously real. They played the audio recording of Julian bragging about neutralizing me, and I heard gasps in the courtroom, saw jury members' faces harden, watched Julian's expensive legal team realize they were fighting a losing battle. He took the stand in his own defense, which his lawyers clearly advised against, and he tried to explain, tried to make people understand that he'd been young and ambitious, and scared that his genius sister would overshadow him, that the frame job had spiraled out of control, that he'd never meant for it to go so far. He even cried, real tears this time I think, not the performative grief he'd shown at that boardroom meeting 20 years ago, but genuine remorse for everything he'd lost and everything he destroyed. But crying doesn't work when the evidence is overwhelming, and the jury convicted him on all counts after less than a day of deliberation, and the judge sentenced him to 35 years in federal prison, essentially a life sentence for a man in his mid-60s. I watched him being led away one final time, and I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for some feeling to arrive, some sense of completion or closure or satisfaction, and it never came. Julian was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. His empire was destroyed, his reputation was ruined, his family had abandoned him, and I'd won completely and utterly, and all I felt was tired, so deeply tired I could barely keep my eyes open. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected visitors to my door, because the story of the disgraced sister who'd been vindicated after 20 years was too compelling for journalists to ignore, and they tracked me down despite my attempts to remain hidden, despite all my carefully maintained obscurity. I didn't talk to any of them, didn't answer my door or respond to emails or phone calls, because what was I supposed to say? That I'd spent 20 years building a trap for my brother? That I destroyed a global financial firm and disrupted markets worldwide because of a family grudge? That I'd been vindicated but felt more lost than I had when I was living under a false name working as a barista? None of that would make a good soundbite. None of it would fit the narrative they wanted, the story of the wrong sister who'd finally gotten justice, because the truth was too complicated and too dark and too human. But one visitor I did let in, because she had a right to be there, because she was part of the story whether I wanted her to be or not. Her name was Victoria, and she was Julian's oldest daughter, my niece, 23 years old and studying law at Columbia, and she showed up at my apartment 3 months after the trial with questions I didn't know how to answer. She looked like our mother, this girl, had the same elegant features and intelligent eyes, and seeing her was like being haunted by a ghost of what might have been, a glimpse of the family life I'd never gotten to have. She asked me why I'd waited 20 years instead of exposing Julian immediately, why I'd built such an elaborate revenge instead of just taking my evidence to the authorities, why I destroyed so many lives in my quest to destroy one man. And I told her the truth, or as much truth as I could articulate, that revenge isn't rational, that pain accumulates over decades and transforms into something cold and patient and monstrous, that I'd become the very thing I'd set out to punish, and I was only now beginning to understand what that meant. Victoria told me about growing up with Julian as a father, about how charming and attentive he'd been, how he'd coached her soccer team and helped her with homework and told her she could be anything she wanted to be. And I listened to her describe my brother as a good father, and I didn't know how to reconcile that version with the man who'd framed me and threatened our mother and built an empire on stolen work. She said she hated him now for what he'd done to me, but she also missed him, missed the father she thought she knew, and she was angry at me for taking him away, even though she knew intellectually that I'd only exposed what he'd always been. She asked me if I thought it was worth it, if destroying Julian had healed the wound he created 20 years ago, and I told her no, honestly no, that revenge doesn't heal anything, it just creates new wounds on top of the old ones, and if I could go back I'm not sure I'd make the same choices, but I also didn't know what other choices I could have made. Because by the time I'd received my mother's journal, I was already too far down the path of revenge to see any other way forward. We talked for hours, Victoria and I, this niece I'd never met having a conversation with an aunt who was essentially a stranger, and by the end of it we were both crying, mourning the family that could have been, the relationships that had been sacrificed to pride and ambition and revenge. She asked if we could stay in touch, if maybe we could try to build some kind of relationship despite everything. And I said yes, even though I wasn't sure it was a good idea, wasn't sure I should be allowed near Julian's children after what I'd done to their father. But she was insistent, said that she needed to know me, needed to understand the full story, needed to have at least one person in her life who could help her make sense of the wreckage that used to be her family, and I couldn't deny her that, couldn't add one more cruelty to the pile I'd already created. Victoria became a regular visitor after that, stopping by my apartment once or twice a month, bringing coffee and questions and slowly, carefully, building a bridge between the past and whatever future we might be able to construct from the ruins. She told me about her siblings, Julian's other children who were still too angry and confused to want to meet me, and she told me about her mother, Julian's ex-wife, who was trying to rebuild her life after discovering everything she believed about her husband was a lie. Through Victoria, I got glimpses of all the collateral damage my revenge had created, all the innocent people whose lives had been upended because I decided my pain mattered more than anything else, and each story was another weight added to the guilt I was learning to carry. I started therapy, finally, because Victoria convinced me I needed it, and I found a therapist who specialized in trauma and family dysfunction, and I spent 2 sessions a week trying to untangle 20 years of pain and rage and revenge, trying to figure out who Alara was when she wasn't defined by what Julian had done to her or what she'd done to him in return. The therapy was brutal, forcing me to confront truths I'd been avoiding, like the fact that I'd been more comfortable as a ghost than as a real person, that revenge had given me purpose and identity in a way that normal life never had, that I'd built my entire adult existence around hating Julian, and now that he was destroyed I had no idea what to build in that hate's place. My therapist asked me once what I would have done with my life if Julian had never betrayed me, if I'd become the joint successor to the family firm as planned, and I realized I had no idea, had never actually wanted that life, had maybe been relieved on some level when Julian had framed me because it had given me permission to pursue revenge instead of having to figure out who I actually was and what I actually wanted. The financial regulators tried to recover assets from Sterling Thorne's collapse, tried to make investors and employees whole, but there wasn't enough left to save because Persephone had been designed to destroy completely, to liquidate everything in the most catastrophic way possible. I was questioned extensively about my role in creating the algorithm, about whether I'd known what Persephone would do, about whether I could be held liable for the financial damage, but I'd covered my tracks too well, had built enough plausible deniability into the system that they couldn't prove I'd intended for it to be weaponized. They knew I'd created Cassandra, knew it had somehow been corrupted into Persephone, but they couldn't prove I'd designed that corruption, couldn't demonstrate that I'd spent 20 years planning to destroy my brother's empire. So they let me go, frustrated but legally powerless, and I walked away from their interrogations with my freedom intact but my conscience in tatters that I tried to help, anonymously, funneling money to the pension funds that had been wiped out, to the employees who'd lost their jobs, to the investors who'd been ruined by Sterling Thorn's collapse. I didn't have much because I'd spent 20 years living in poverty and saving every penny for a revenge that hadn't required much money, just skill and patience and perfect hatred. But what I had, I gave, creating anonymous donations that couldn't be traced back to me, trying to make some small amend for the damage I'd caused. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something, a small gesture toward redemption that felt both necessary and futile, like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. Victoria graduated from law school 2 years after the trial, and I went to her graduation, sitting in the back of the auditorium, watching her walk across that stage to receive her diploma, and I thought about my mother, about how proud she would have been, about how she'd have loved to see her granddaughter succeed in ways she'd never gotten to witness. After the ceremony, Victoria found me in the crowd and hugged me, introducing me to her friends as her Aunt Alara, and I saw some of them recognize the name, saw the calculations happening behind their eyes as they connected me to the scandal. But Victoria didn't care, didn't flinch, just kept her arm around me like she was proud to claim our relationship despite everything. Her younger siblings were there too, Michael and Sophie, and they were polite but distant, still processing what their father had done and what I'd done in return, still trying to figure out if I was a hero or a villain or just another damaged person in a family full of damage. I started teaching, of all things, because Victoria suggested I needed to do something constructive with my skills, needed to create instead of destroy for the first time in 2 decades. I got a position at a community college teaching basic computer programming, using a carefully sanitized version of my resume that emphasized my early work and omitted the 20-year gap and the global financial scandal. My students had no idea who I was, saw me as just another middle-aged adjunct professor who was decent at explaining algorithms and patient with their questions, and there was something healing about that anonymity, about being seen as ordinary instead of as the architect of one of the biggest financial collapses in modern history. I taught them about ethics in programming, about how code could be used to build or destroy, about the responsibility that came with creating systems that affected people's lives, and I wondered if they could hear the weight in my voice when I warned them about the dangers of letting their technical skills outpace their moral reasoning. One of my students, a young woman named Priya who reminded me of myself at that age, stayed after class one day and asked me if I'd ever worked on anything big, anything that had real-world impact, and I told her I had, once a long time ago, and it had taught me that impact wasn't always positive, that the ability to change the world was a burden as much as a gift. She looked at me with those young, eager eyes and asked what I'd worked on, and I told her it was a trading algorithm that had ended badly, and I'd spent the rest of my life trying to understand the ethical implications of what I'd created. She asked if I regretted it, and I told her the truth, that regret was too simple a word for what I felt, that it was more like grief mixed with guilt mixed with a terrible understanding that I couldn't undo what I'd done. I could only try to do better going forward. Julian wrote to me from prison, a letter that arrived 3 years after his conviction, and I almost threw it away unopened, almost decided I didn't want to hear whatever he had to say, but curiosity and something that might have been residual familial obligation made me open it. His handwriting was the same, that confident script I remembered from birthday cards and congratulations notes from our childhood, but the words were different, stripped of the charm and performance that had characterized every interaction I'd had with him for 2 decades. He didn't apologize, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't try to explain or justify what he'd done. Instead, he wrote about our childhood, about memories I'd forgotten or repressed, about the day I'd first shown him Cassandra and how he'd felt this terrible mixture of pride and envy, pride in his brilliant sister, and envy that she created something he never could. He wrote about our mother, about how she'd come to visit him in prison before she died, how she told him she knew what he'd done and she could never forgive him, and how that conversation had been the last time she'd spoken to him, how she died knowing her son was a monster and there was nothing she could do to save him. He wrote about the 20 years he'd spent living with what he'd done, how every success had been tainted by the knowledge that it was built on theft and betrayal, how every time he'd looked at his children he'd wondered if they'd ever find out the truth and hate him for it, how he'd become so good at lying that he couldn't always tell when he was being honest anymore. He wrote that he'd known about Persephone, not the details but the possibility, that he'd spent years waiting for me to trigger it, checking the system obsessively for signs of corruption, hiring the best security people he could find to look for backdoors and logic bombs. But he'd never found it because I'd hidden it too well. Had built it into the very foundation of Cassandra in ways that made it invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. He'd lived for 20 years, knowing that his empire might collapse at any moment, that his genius sister might be out there somewhere planning his destruction, and he'd been right. And in some horrible way he was relieved it was finally over, relieved he didn't have to carry the weight of what he'd done anymore, relieved even to be in prison because at least it was honest, at least he was finally paying a price for his sins. The letter ended with a single question. Was it worth it, Alara? Did destroying me heal anything? Or did you just prove that we're both capable of monstrous things when we're hurt badly enough? I read that letter a dozen times, and I never answered it, because I didn't know how to, didn't know if I wanted to give him the satisfaction of a response, or if responding would be opening a door I'd worked so hard to close. But his question haunted me, echoed my therapist's questions and Victoria's questions, and the questions I asked myself in the dark hours of the morning when I couldn't sleep. Had it been worth it? I destroyed the man who destroyed me, had proven I was smarter and more patient and more ruthless than he'd ever been, had reclaimed my genius from the shadows and used it to architect the perfect revenge, and I'd never felt emptier, never felt more lost, never felt more uncertain about who I was or what my life was supposed to mean now that the driving purpose of 2 decades was complete. My father's colleagues started reaching out, years after the scandal, offering opportunities to consult or advise or join boards because apparently my technical skills were still valuable even if my family history was radioactive. I turned them all down, not out of principle but out of exhaustion, because I couldn't imagine returning to that world, couldn't imagine sitting in boardrooms and analyzing markets and building systems that affected millions of lives. I'd seen what that world did to people, how it turned my father into a corporate predator and Julian into a thief, and me into someone who could destroy global markets to prove a point, and I wanted no part of it. Victoria argued with me about this, said I was wasting my talents, said I could do so much good if I applied myself to solving real problems instead of hiding in a community college teaching basic programming, but I told her that teaching was solving real problems, that every student I helped understand ethical coding was a small step toward preventing the next Persephone, the next brilliant person who'd use their skills to destroy instead of build. I visited Julian in prison once, 5 years after his conviction, because Victoria begged me to, said he was declining rapidly, said he'd asked for me, said she thought we both needed closure even if we didn't want it. I drove 4 hours to the federal facility where he was incarcerated, went through the humiliating security checks, sat in the sterile visiting room waiting for them to bring him out, and when he finally appeared I almost didn't recognize him. Prison had aged him decades, turned his hair white and his face gaunt, carved lines of suffering into features that had once been so effortlessly handsome. We sat across from each other at a metal table, neither of us speaking for a long time, and finally Julian said, "You look well, Alara. Teaching suits you." And I said, "You look like hell, Julian. Prison suits you too." And we both laughed, this horrible, broken sound that was more grief than humor, and then we talked, really talked for the first time in 25 years. He told me about prison life, about how he'd found a kind of peace in the routine and isolation, how not having to maintain his persona anymore was actually a relief, how he'd started teaching other inmates basic financial literacy because it gave him something useful to do with the skills he'd stolen from me. I told him about teaching, about Victoria, about my attempts to build a life that wasn't defined by revenge or hatred or the past. He asked if I'd forgiven him, and I said no, honestly no, and I probably never would, but I was learning to live with what had happened, learning to carry it without letting it crush me. He said that was more than he deserved, and I agreed, and we sat in silence for a while, 2 middle-aged siblings who destroyed each other and were now trying to figure out how to exist in the wreckage. Before I left, Julian asked me one more question. He asked if I'd always known, if I'd built Persephone into Cassandra from the very beginning intending it to be a weapon, or if it had been a genuine failsafe that I'd later decided to weaponize. And I told him the truth, the thing I'd never admitted to anyone, not even my therapist. I told him that when I'd built Persephone, when I was young and idealistic and believed my brother was my best friend, I'd built it as a genuine failsafe, a way to shut down Cassandra if it ever started causing harm, if it ever stopped being a tool and became a threat. But after he betrayed me, After I'd spent years in the wilderness thinking about revenge, I'd realized that Persephone could be so much more than a failsafe, could be transformed into a weapon with just a few modifications to its core logic, and I'd spent years planning those modifications, designing them in my head, knowing that someday I'd have a chance to implement them, and Julian would never see it coming because he didn't understand Cassandra the way I did, didn't know its secrets the way its creator did. So the answer to his question was both. Persephone had started as protection and become destruction, had transformed from a safety mechanism into a weapon because I transformed from a trusting girl into a woman consumed by revenge. And that transformation was on him, but it was also on me, was the result of his choices but also my choices, was the inevitable outcome of what happens when you hurt someone brilliant enough to turn their pain into perfect retribution. Julian nodded when I told him this, like he'd suspected as much, and he said, "We're the same, you and I. We both used our gifts to destroy. The only difference is I destroyed you first." And I said, "No, Julian. The difference is I destroyed you better." And I left him there in that visiting room, walked out of the prison and back to my car, and I cried for the first time in years, cried for the family we'd been and the people we'd become, and the waste of it all, the beautiful, terrible waste. Victoria got engaged last year to a kind, steady man named David who works in nonprofit management, and she asked me to help plan the wedding, to be part of the family celebration, and I said yes, even though weddings make me think about everything I'll never have, the normal life I traded away for revenge. The wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in a garden with close friends and family, and I stood next to Victoria's mother during the ceremony, Julian's ex-wife who'd been so kind to me despite everything, who'd said she understood that I'd done what I felt I had to do and she didn't blame me for destroying the man who'd lied to her for 20 years. Michael and Sophie were there too, Julian's younger children, and they were warmer to me now, had spent years processing their father's crimes and their aunt's revenge, and had apparently decided I was more victim than villain, or at least complicated enough to deserve a place in the family they were trying to rebuild from the ashes. During the reception, Victoria asked me to dance, and as we swayed to some generic wedding song, she said, "Thank you for being here. Thank you for trying." And I said, "Thank you for letting me try. Thank you for being patient with a broken woman who didn't know how to be an aunt." And she said, "You're learning. We're all learning. That's all we can do." And I realized she was right. That life after revenge was just a long process of learning how to be human again, how to have relationships that weren't defined by vengeance or pain, how to build instead of destroy, even when destruction had become your default mode. I still teach at the community college, still live in my modest apartment, still see my therapist twice a week, still visit Victoria and her growing family, still carry the weight of what I did and try to figure out how to live with it. I'm 48 now, 6 years past the gala where I triggered Persephone, and I'm slowly, painfully, learning to be Alara again, not the betrayed sister, or the avenging genius, or the woman who destroyed global markets to prove a point. Just Alara, a middle-aged woman with a complicated past and an uncertain future who's trying to do better than she did, trying to create more than she destroys, trying to teach the next generation to be wiser than she was. Julian died last month, a heart attack in prison, and Victoria called me crying, and I drove to her house and held her while she grieved for the father who'd been a monster and a criminal, but also the man who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with her homework and told her she could be anything. We planned a small, private funeral, just family, and I stood at my brother's grave and tried to feel something other than exhaustion, tried to summon hatred or forgiveness or grief. But all I felt was tired, so deeply tired of carrying all of this, tired of the weight of what we'd done to each other, tired of being defined by a betrayal that happened 25 years ago and a revenge that happened 6 years ago, and all the years in between that I'd lost to pain and planning. Victoria asked me to say something at the funeral, to speak about Julian from my perspective, and I stood in front of that small gathering and I told them the truth. All of it, the betrayal and the revenge and the 20 years of perfect hatred that had consumed my life. I told them about the brother I'd loved and the man he'd become, and the monster I'd become in response. And I told them that I didn't know if there was a moral to the story, didn't know if justice had been served or if we'd just proven that hurt people, and genius applied to destruction is still just destruction. I told them that I'd spent 6 years trying to figure out if my revenge had been worth it, and the answer was no, it hadn't been, because revenge never is, Because destroying someone else doesn't heal your own wounds, it just creates new wounds on top of the old ones until you're nothing but scarred tissue and regret. And then I told them about the lesson I'd learned, the thing I tried to teach my students, the wisdom that had come too late for Julian and me but might save someone else. I said that technical brilliance without moral wisdom is just a weapon waiting to be used, that the ability to destroy is always easier than the ability to create, that revenge is a fire that consumes everything including the person holding it, and that forgiveness isn't about the person who wronged you, it's about freeing yourself from the prison of hatred, so you can finally start to live again. I said that Julian and I had both been brilliant, both been wounded, both been capable of extraordinary things, and we'd chosen to use our gifts to destroy each other instead of to build something beautiful together, and that choice had cost us everything, had stolen 25 years from me and had cost him his life, and the tragedy wasn't that he died in prison. The tragedy was that we'd wasted our lives on a war neither of us could win. After the funeral, I went back to my apartment, and I finally threw away my mother's journal, the leather-bound catalyst that had turned my cold watching into active revenge, because I didn't need it anymore, didn't need the evidence of Julian's crimes or our mother's guilt or the mysterious benefactor's intervention. I kept one thing from it, a single page where my mother had written about a day when Julian and I were children, playing in the backyard, building an elaborate fort out of cardboard boxes and blankets, working together with perfect synchronicity, the way only siblings who truly love each other can. She'd written about watching us and thinking that we'd always have each other, that no matter what happened in life, we'd always be a team, and the innocence of that observation, the tragic irony of how wrong she'd been, was almost unbearable. I'm writing this now, 6 years after the revenge and 1 month after Julian's death, because my therapist suggested that telling the whole story might help me finally process it, might help me see the arc of it clearly instead of just swimming in the trauma. She said that stories have power, that shaping experience into narrative gives us distance and perspective, and maybe that's true, or maybe I'm just searching for meaning in something that was always meaningless, just too brilliant, damaged people destroying each other because they could, because they've been hurt and they had the skills to hurt back perfectly. But if there's a meaning to extract from this mess, if there's a lesson worth learning from the ashes of the Sterling family, it's this. Revenge is a trap that looks like justice, and the person it traps most completely is the one seeking it. I got my revenge, proved my genius, destroyed my destroyer, and I've spent 6 years discovering that none of it mattered, none of it healed the wound, none of it brought back the 20 years I lost or the family I had or the person I might have been if Julian had just been honest with our father 25 years ago about his fears and insecurities instead of betraying me to eliminate the competition. I teach a class now on the ethics of artificial intelligence and algorithmic systems, and I always start the semester with a case study about a brilliant programmer who built a trading algorithm that eventually destroyed the company using it. I never tell the students that I'm talking about myself, never reveal that Cassandra and Persephone were mine, but I walk them through the technical decisions and the ethical implications, and I ask them to consider what they would do if they had that kind of power, if they could build a system that would work perfectly for decades before revealing its true nature. Some students say they'd never build something like that, would never weaponize their own creation, and I tell them that's what I thought too, when I was their age, before I learned that pain can transform idealism into ruthlessness faster than you'd believe possible. Victoria is pregnant with her first child, my great-niece or great-nephew, and she's asked me to be involved in the baby's life, to be the aunt I never got to be to her and her siblings. I said yes, even though I'm terrified, even though I'm not sure I know how to be a positive influence on a child when my own story is so dark and complicated. But Victoria says that's exactly why I should be involved, because I understand consequences in a way most people don't, because I've lived through the worst of what can happen when brilliant people make terrible choices, and because I'm trying, every day, to be better than I was. She says the baby will need people in their life who understand that redemption is possible, that people can change, that past mistakes don't have to define your entire existence. I'm not sure I believe in redemption, not really, not in the storybook sense where you do enough good works to balance out the bad and suddenly you're absolved. I think redemption, if it exists at all, is just the daily practice of trying to do better, of making choices that create instead of destroy, of using your gifts to help instead of harm. I think it's showing up to teach basic programming to community college students who'll never know your name meant something terrible once. I think it's being present in your niece's life, even when it reminds you of everything you lost. I think it's carrying your sins honestly instead of trying to justify them or explain them away. So that's my story, the story of Alara Sterling who built a weapon and called it genius, who spent 20 years planning perfect revenge and discovered that perfection is just another word for emptiness, who destroyed her brother and found that destruction destroys the destroyer just as surely as the destroyed. It's not a happy ending, not a triumphant tale of justice served, just an honest accounting of what happens when you let pain become purpose and revenge become identity. Julian is dead, Cassandra and Persephone are both gone, Sterling Thorn is a cautionary tale in business schools, and I'm still here, still breathing, still trying to figure out who Alara is when she's not defined by what was done to her or what she did in response. Maybe that's enough. Maybe learning to live with what you've done, learning to carry it without letting it crush you, learning to build small things in the shadow of the big thing you destroyed. Maybe that's the closest thing to redemption that people like Julian and me ever get. Maybe the story doesn't end with satisfaction or closure or peace, just with the understanding that you did what you did and now you have to live with it. And the living is harder than the doing ever was, but you do it anyway, because what else is there? I look at my hands now, the same hands that coated Cassandra and Persephone, and they're older, marked with age spots and the beginning of arthritis, and they're teaching students and helping Victoria plan for her baby and trying to create small good things in a world where I once created something monumentally destructive. They're not empty anymore. These hands, they're just tired, just carrying the weight of everything they've built and everything they've destroyed, and they're still working, still trying, still reaching for something that might look like redemption, even if it never quite arrives. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served, or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss next week's chilling confession.